the gates of hell. For many modern listeners, those words call up one vivid scene. Jesus and his disciples standing beside a dark cave at Caesarea Philippi, while Jesus points toward a pagan entrance to the underworld. But the phrase did not begin at that cave. One history begins in ancient texts about death. The other begins at a limestone cliff where deep water once filled a natural cavern. Matthew brings the two into the same district. We cannot recover one reaction shared by every listener. We can recover the language and setting available to them. The question is how those two histories meet, and how far the evidence lets us join them. Matthew says Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi. That identifies a real area, not a precise speaking spot. Matthew leaves the immediate setting undescribed. No cave-side position, sanctuary reference, or pointing gesture is recorded. That boundary matters, because once an illustration shows Jesus pointing at the cave, the image has already decided location, intention, and meaning before the evidence has. To ask what the first listeners may have heard, we have to begin with what Matthew actually gives them. Peter identifies Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Jesus responds with the wordplay between Peter and rock. He says he will build his church, that the gates of Hades will not overpower it, and that he will give Peter the keys of the kingdom, with authority to bind and loose. Christians have debated Peter, the rock, the church, and the keys for centuries. Some readings emphasize Peter himself. Others emphasize his confession, Christ, or a relationship among them. Traditions also differ over how the authority symbolized by the keys continues. This episode will not settle all of those disputes, but it cannot remove the gates of Hades from that larger statement and turn them into a slogan standing by itself. The Greek phrase is pile hadou, the gates of Hades. Some English Bibles preserve Hades, others use hell. Still others translate the image as the powers of death. Those choices do not create the same picture in an English listener's mind. Today, hell often compresses final punishment, fire, Satan, demons, and the world of the dead into one idea. Matthew does not use one Greek term for all of those things. He also uses Gehenna, a different word with a different history. Here, Hades belongs to ancient language about the realm of the dead. In Job, God asks whether the gates of death have been revealed. In Isaiah, a dying king says he is being sent to the gates of Sheol. Other ancient Jewish texts also speak of gates of death or Hades. This is not a detailed map of the afterlife. It presents death as a realm or boundary beyond ordinary human control. So the phrase carried meaning before Matthew's story reached Caesarea Philippi. Jesus did not need a local cave in order to speak about the gates of Hades. But Matthew still tells us where the conversation took place. So the place deserves investigation, even though its interpretive role remains uncertain. Caesarea Philippi lay north of the Sea of Galilee, near the foot of Mount Hermon, in a landscape of rock, vegetation, and abundant water. The older place name Paneas was connected with the worship of Pan. At the base of a limestone cliff stood a natural cave. Josephus describes it as remarkably deep and filled with still water, with springs of the Jordan rising beneath the caverns. He also reports that Herod the Great built a white stone temple nearby in honor of Caesar. Later, Herod's son Philip built up Paneas as a city at the sources of the Jordan and called it Caesarea. A visitor was not approaching only a rural cave. This was a landscape where a striking natural feature, a cult associated with Pan, Herodian rule, urban development, and public honor for Caesar, overlapped. Even the city's name carried an imperial claim. Coins issued under Philip at Caesarea Paneas show a four-columned temple on the reverse. That is evidence that temple imagery belonged to the city's official public language. It is not an architectural photograph. The coin cannot tell us the exact dimensions of a building or prove which excavated foundation it depicts. That distinction becomes even more important when we look at the sanctuary visitors see today. The modern site is visually powerful. The cliff, cave, niches, terraces, foundations, and remains of several structures easily merge into one mental picture. But they did not all belong to one moment. The sanctuary at Paneas was built, altered, expanded, damaged, and reused across centuries. The natural cave and spring were defining features. Cultic activity at Paneas predates the Roman city. Josephus reports Herod's temple. Philip's Caesarea belonged to the early Roman landscape. Many of the monumental remains that dominate modern photographs and reconstructions, however, come from later phases. A complex directly in front of the cave had often been identified as the Temple Herod, built for Augustus. Recent excavators instead date its first major phase to the last third of the 1st century, later than the usual period proposed for Matthew's scene. They also place much of the larger monumental sanctuary along the cliff in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. These findings are a recent archaeological reassessment, not a declaration that every older question has been settled. They show something more basic. A photograph of the sanctuary today is not a photograph of the sanctuary in the time of Jesus. Hold the camera in one place. Remove the later temples. Remove the later courtyards and some of the familiar niches. Keep the cliff. Keep the cave. Keep the water. Keep a developing city, an older cultic history, and only those built features that the evidence can responsibly place in the early Roman landscape. The scene becomes less crowded. It does not become empty. The cave made depth physically visible. The spring made the unseen interior of the rock part of the landscape. Whether Jesus or his listeners connected those features directly with Hades is possible, but not documented. For someone already familiar with ancient images of death and the underworld, the setting could have made the phrase more vivid. The cult of Pan gave the district a religious identity, different from a Galilean village. The city built by Philip and named for Caesar added visible claims about rulers, benefactors, and authority. Those features may have sharpened the atmosphere around a confession about the Messiah, a promised community, and the power of Hades. The sources used for this episode do not establish the gates of Hades as a formal ancient name for the cave. Nor does Matthew identify the cave as Jesus' exclusive visual reference. The place can be read as a setting that may sharpen the image without defining it. The history of the phrase approaches from one direction: gates of death, Sheol, Hades, and the limits of mortal life. The history of the place approaches from another: cliff, cave, spring, Pan, Herodian building, Philip's city, and imperial honor. They meet in Matthew 16. They remain two kinds of evidence. That brings us back to the sentence itself. What kind of power does Matthew's image give to the gates of Hades? At minimum, the phrase evokes death and the realm of the dead. Major translations render Matthew's verb with language such as prevail against, overcome, or overpower. On one strong reading, death will not overcome or contain the community Jesus promises to build. A serious competing interpretation hears a more active conflict. On that reading, Hades is not only the realm of the dead. Its gates stand in an eschatological struggle against the community Jesus builds, and hostile powers of the underworld fail to overcome it. That reading gives the verse a stronger conflict image, although Matthew does not describe the conflict in detail. The two readings can overlap, but they are not identical. A popular modern argument moves in another direction. Gates are defensive structures. Therefore, the church must be attacking hell. The first observation is simple enough. Gates protect an entrance and help close a fortified place. But that physical fact does not turn Matthew's sentence into an explicit command to storm the underworld. Gates mark an entrance or boundary. Whether Matthew's image emphasizes death's confinement, hostile assault, or the power of the realm itself remains disputed. And Matthew does not narrate an assault. He says, "The gates of Hades will not overpower what Jesus will build." The history of interpretation reflects that range. Christians have read the verse as a promise about death, the endurance of the church, hostile evil, persecution, and spiritual conflict. The verse clearly gives a promise. Turning that promise into a direct command to attack hell requires an additional interpretive step. The immediate context keeps the promise connected to a community, to Peter, to rock, to keys, and to authority. Whatever conclusion a tradition reaches about Peter and the rock, Matthew's claim is that Hades will not gain the upper hand over what Jesus builds. Then the narrative turns directly to Jesus' suffering, death, and resurrection. That sequence does not settle the metaphor, but it places the promise about Hades beside a story in which death immediately becomes central, and in which Peter resists the path Jesus describes. The passage is therefore larger than a dramatic name for a pagan cave. And who were the first listeners? Inside Matthew's story, they are the disciples with Jesus somewhere in the district. Historically, we cannot recover how much each person knew about Paneas, local cult, or the landscape. Matthew's earliest audiences encountered a narrated location. Some may have known the region, others may never have seen it. They could share biblical images of death without sharing the same local knowledge. So, they all would have understood. Asks the evidence to do too much. A better question is what associations were available. The gates of death were available through biblical and Jewish language. The cave, water, Pan's sanctuary, and Caesarea's imperial identity belonged to the setting. A direct cave name, a recorded pointing gesture, and one uniform reaction do not reach us in the same way. The modern portal scene becomes convincing by compressing those levels. It begins with a real place. It adds a plausible association between a dramatic cave and underworld language. Then it often treats an unproven connection as a reported event. Jesus at the cave mouth, pointing at a site formerly called the Gates of Hades. Some versions add later architecture or dramatic ritual claims that require their own site-specific and date-specific evidence. The result is visually coherent. But visual coherence is not historical proof. Modern teaching materials do document versions that place Jesus near the cave, treat it as a physical image of the gates of hell, and derive a command to attack or storm those gates. An overstated reconstruction creates two avoidable risks. Correction can appear to weaken the passage, and source failure can weaken trust in the teaching. The promise in Matthew does not depend on a gesture the gospel never records, a building from the wrong century, or a ritual claim without a traceable source. So what did the gates of Hades mean? At minimum, they evoked death and the realm of the dead, a power that would not overpower the community Jesus says he will build. A more active reading sees hostile powers of the underworld failing in the same conflict. Caesarea Philippi may have made those associations more concrete through its cliff, cave, water, cultic landscape, and public claims of power. But the place is a setting, not a dictionary entry. The cave can remain historically important without becoming a supernatural portal. and in the promise Matthew preserves. Hades does not receive the final word.